Hello, Worldview listeners. I want to take a moment and give a shout out to my friend Luke and his team at increasecreative.co. This season of our podcast, Luke has been helping with his team there to produce the content that I hope that's been a blessing and encouragement to you. It's been a help to me to have his behind the scenes work, and I want to give him a shout out and let you guys know about his company. Increasecreative.co is a great partner for you to consider for powerful church communication. Luke's team can create custom websites, compelling graphic designs. They help with original video and, as you've noticed, original podcast content. It allows people like you, people like me, to connect with our communities. So I'd encourage you to let them handle the creative aspect of what you need help with so you can focus on your mission. Take a moment, visit increasecreative.co to learn more about how Luke can help you. That's increasecreative.co.
Welcome to Worldview, a podcast featuring teaching and conversations with Dr. Mike Lester that focus on helping faithful disciples develop a biblical worldview. Thanks for joining us, and here's your host, Mike Lester.
Well, welcome back to another episode here of Worldview. I'm your host, Mike Lester, and I'm excited about the third episode today of this new season here in 2026. Honestly, I have to admit that when I was growing up, never would I have even imagined one day we would actually be saying 2026. And yet here we are. As I think about the turning of the calendar, as I think about time marching onward, it just flows perfectly with and synchronizes with our opening season here in 2026, the theme of it, go forward. If you've listened to the first two episodes already this season, you know that there is this event in Old Testament history that becomes the defining moment for how powerful God is. In fact, from Exodus 14 onward, God will often identify himself to the nation with this phrase: I am the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of Egypt. And that simple statement encapsulates all the plagues. It encapsulates this Red Sea moment that we have been looking at as sort of the backdrop of this season's episodes. And so in the middle of that event, Moses is standing at the Red Sea. There's an impossible wall of water before him. And there is an impossible army behind him. He has been called to lead, but the path is not clear. And God, in Exodus 14, rather than say, take these 5 steps and turn left and do this, he just gives a simple instruction: go forward. And so in this opening season of 2026, we're talking about leadership, whether we're leading ourselves, leading our families, leading an organization, whether that's secular or ministry related. And regardless of what type scenario we find ourselves in, all of us come to these moments when we know God wants us to go forward, but in the same token, we know that the path isn't clear. And so what do? And I introduced in our opening 2 episodes the fact that this process is sort of 3 big movements that we're working through. And within each movement, there are different steps or different stages or different action items, whatever term you want to use, that we sort of work our way through in this overall process of facing an impossible moment, knowing God wants us to move, but the path isn't clear. What do we do to keep from just overanalyzing and developing the paralysis of analysis? What do we do instead of becoming so overwhelmed we just do nothing? What's the process? And so as we begin to open this up to getting our minds wrapped around the topic, we introduce this first stage of just trying to survey the situation and get the facts. And the step 1 in that was basically assess the situation. Today we want to start talking about in episode 3, the second step. The second step in that first big movement of just surveying the surroundings, the environment, the landscape of where I'm currently facing. Step two is understanding the big picture. You know, if we lose the big picture, and the smallest molehill will feel like a mountain. That's the power of exaggeration. That's the power of being overwhelmed because we lose perspective. And so when we talk about getting our minds wrapped around the big picture, as leaders, we're talking about having the right perspective. Having the right perspective. I want to give you an opening illustration here, and I need to refer to my notes a little bit. I wish I could just tell it to you strictly from memory, but I'm afraid I'd miss one of the parts of it. Well, we're going to go back to the time of World War being ended, and it was brutal. The Great World War, as people called it. They didn't know it was just World War One. So this has now come to a close, and brutal aftermath is being now assessed, and people are trying to adjust to a new normal. Nations are rebuilding, and they're desperately trying to learn from a catastrophe that, frankly, was world-defining. And in the middle of this scenario, I want to focus on an interesting tidbit of history from the nation of France. That nation in particular was determined not to suffer from trench warfare again. It had been a brutal war for them, and they vowed to themselves, we will never find ourselves in that type of trench warfare again. And so they began to meticulously study that war, and they built their defenses to solve the problems that came in World War I, so that if they should meet them in future conflicts, they would be ready. So their study, in essence, helped them solve the problem of yesterday. And I just want that to sit in your mind for just a minute. In fact, France poured enormous resources into building what became known as the Maginot Line. This was a vast chain of fortresses, tunnels, artillery placements, and underground rail systems, all along this border with the nation of Germany. You know, from any perspective, this Maginot Line was an engineering marvel, a great testimony to their ingenuity. Unfortunately, it was also a masterpiece of what we call today tunnel vision. For all their craftsmanship, for all their strategy, for all their attention to the details that went into building this and fortifying this Maginot Line, they missed the proverbial forest with trees. In all their preparation, they failed to recognize that modern warfare had changed. Tanks were now fast and maneuverable. The Luftwaffe gave Germany devastating air mobility. The Blitzkrieg emphasized speed, not attrition. See, Germany just simply went around the Maginot Line through the Ardennes forest, the very forest that France had considered impassable. Interestingly, France's tunnel vision allowed them to fixate on one specific narrow threat from a previous war, and they ignored the broader strategic reality. I guess the moral of this simple vignette, from history, is simply this. If we only prepare for yesterday's challenges, we're going to fail to see tomorrow's dangers as well as tomorrow's opportunities. If we lack big picture perspective, we may be fortified, but we'll be fortified in the wrong places. It's an interesting lesson from history, isn't it? And I want to use that to speak to us as leaders about the importance of not losing view of the big picture. Because as ministry leaders and family leaders and personal leaders, we can fall into the same trap that the nation of France encountered. We can carefully plan to meet the needs that arose from yesterday's battles, often missing what God is doing in the very moment. And in these moments of difficulty, when the path isn't clear, these Red Sea moments, we don't want to be guilty of tunnel vision, because that will keep us from making the right decision. We talk about tunnel vision often. I guess we probably should give a working definition. Let's call it becoming so fixated on the one thing that we stop noticing other information around us. Maybe we're locked into one detail, locked into one problem, and we miss the bigger picture. Here's an example in ministry. We've got 75 families in our church, and one family is just really causing us consternation. They're really fighting the vision. We've got 74 families that are, whatever you want to do, Pastor, we want to follow you. We love the vision. But we become so fixated on the one that we lose sight of the big picture. We get discouraged. And many times, you've seen it, I've seen it. We've seen a pastor resign from a place when the vast majority of the people were for him, were for the pastor, but becoming fixated on the negative, the one small piece, that tunnel vision. I just can't fix these people. I just can't fix these people. Led to disillusionment, led to discouragement. It led to them continually trying to fortify against this negativity, and all of this time missing the positive impact they could be having with the 80 or 90% of the church family who are ready to move forward. And this isn't just in preaching. This can happen in education, in our classroom. We've got a class of 30. 27 of them want to learn. 3 of them are a challenge. They're disruptive. And we just spend all of our energy trying to convince them to learn, which there's a part that's needed. But sometimes we can go to the neglect of the 90% who want to learn. It's a big picture. Sometimes we can look at all the things that we're still needing in our ministry. These are genuine needs, and we lose sight of all the things that God has provided already. And so in ministry, if we want to lead when the path isn't clear, one of the things we really, really need to focus on as we try to assess the big picture and survey the landscape, we assess the big picture, we assess the situation, and we want to just make sure that we're seeing this not emotionally, but with data. What is the big picture? What is God doing in my life right now? Where am I at right now? What is God trying to teach me? In these situations, we can become disoriented, we can become paralyzed, we can become fearful. We can start to view our entire life, our entire mission, the entire direction of our life through the lens of one situation. And that's not fair to the rest of our life. That's not fair to those who love us. And it's not fair to God who's called us, because he sees the big picture. If we succumb to this situation and this temptation, eventually it distorts our view of God's sovereignty, because we're just viewing it through the wrong lens. It distorts our view of God's purpose for our life, and it distorts the view of our understanding of the sufficiency of how God's Spirit leads us. So we're just called to verify and validate with facts, not feelings. I know the world we live in. How do you feel about that? How does this make you feel? And frankly, we can't lead to the goal of trying to make everybody feel something. That's a vain, empty, unceasing journey that we'll never accomplish. So we verify, we validate, and this underscores the fact that leaders must be controlled and led by the Spirit. And sometimes in those moments where it's very, very difficult, really difficult, we can be guilty of developing this type of tunnel vision, the very thing we warn our followers not to do. So we need to view this difficulty, this unclear path, this unclear decision in front of us through the lens of a big picture framework. That will help us to stay grounded and ready to move forward. So I was thinking about this principle biblically. And you'll probably think about examples I won't mention, but the first one that came to my mind was Joseph in the Old Testament. If anyone in the Old Testament had ample opportunities to lose perspective, to lose sight of the big picture, to develop tunnel vision and just look at life through the one situation that was happening at that moment. Wow. I think Joseph is a fine candidate for that. But rather than focusing, or maybe we should say obsessing over broken dreams and horrible conditions, he chose to remain grounded. He chose to trust that God writes long stories. We forget that. We're so trained to think of immediate gratification. We push a button and there's instant results. Our food is in a microwave and we go through fast food restaurants and everything is quick. It's at our fingertips. Information is right there. And we sometimes can get so caught up in the short term. We can be guilty of forgetting that God writes long, long stories. I know we're wired for the instant. I know we're wired for the immediate. But as leaders, it does us well to remember that God writes these long stories, and in remembering that, it helps us to keep the right perspective. Think about when Joseph confronts his brothers at the end of the narrative. They are nervous because, their dad is gone. He was sort of the buffer in their mind that was protecting them. What's going to happen now that he's removed? And you hear Joseph say something like this. Hey, listen, guys, it was God who sent me here in front of you. It was God that sent me here ahead of you. And he did that so I can preserve your life. Oh, look, I know you meant it for evil. I know that. I'm not dumb. I know what you were doing. But I want you to know that God had a bigger plan than what you were doing. And God meant it for good. Wow. I just am amazed at that perspective and that faith. The big picture for Joseph provided him context. He saw that one moment when his brothers sold him into slavery wasn't the defining moment of his life. It was just a small piece on the way to God's big story that he was writing over 20, 30, 40-year period. He had context. And that context gave him clarity. He saw what his brothers didn't see. And that context and that clarity gave him courage to go forward. His brothers could have been viewed as vengeful, petty, abusive, definitely dysfunctional. But Joseph viewed them as tools in a sovereign God's hand to accomplish his purpose. I think we skip over all of that when we read Romans 8:28. And yet, everything I've just described is the embodiment of all things working together for good to them who love God. God, according to Isaiah 46, verse 10, sees the beginning from the ending and the ending from the beginning. And he's working, he's navigating, he's bringing things together by his plan for our life. So the setbacks that come to you, the hard spots that come to you, God is using that to grow you as a leader and to grow your faith. So if we'll choose to view it with a big picture mentality, the big picture framework, it can restore perspective. I love the fact it clarifies our purpose, the big picture does. The big picture helps to delineate priorities because we see what God is doing. And I love this. The big picture removes our emotions from the decision-making process. It allows us to interpret the Red Sea moment biblically and accurately. Well, we could talk about Joseph. We could talk about Moses. We could talk about Paul being beaten and imprisoned. We could talk about John being exiled on the Isle of Patmos. There's so many narratives we could just go through the scripture and pull on that thread, and you would see under that thread this principle: how a big picture perspective kept these servants of God grounded in their right mind, able to move forward. It doesn't mean they had times of discouragement. I'm not saying these were super saints. They were flesh and blood, like passions as we have. But the way they finished their race, those who finished well were those who had a big picture perspective. Let me give you some thoughts just in today's episode about just some practical steps under this big picture framework. How do we recalibrate our lives to bring the big picture back into focus? Maybe you're hearing this today and the big picture seems blurry. It's out of focus. You see the tree that's right in front of you, and it's a big tree, and you're about to hit it head on. You're not seeing the forest. How do you recalibrate? How do you move from seeing trees to remembering the forest? Let me give you a couple of just categorical decisions to think through. Let's talk about the category of just spirituality. Spiritually, what should we do? There comes moments in our lives when we just simply need to re-anchor our hearts to God's larger and longer story. This is a conscious decision to take a breath and to realize, God, I'm so seeing this up close and personal. I'm not seeing the big picture, but I know that you write long stories. And I'm resubmitting, I'm re-anchoring myself to that truth. We do that by remembering God's past faithfulness. God, I know this is not the only time in my life I've seen a tree like this or an unclear path like this. And I know when I think back to those previous times, you faithfully brought me through it. I know you're going to do the same here because you have a purpose for my life, and I'm endeavoring to follow that purpose. And I know you want what's best for me. You're working it for my good as well as your glory. And I trust you and the story that you're writing. I know, Lord, my flesh just wants to pray, please get me out of this. But in my heart, I also want to pray, what do you want me to learn through this? Maybe something about myself you need to teach me. Maybe something about you that I've forgotten or haven't personalized. Help me to not waste this moment of unclarity or in my decision-making process in this difficult moment. Help me, Lord, not to waste it. Help me to have a wide-angle view of this, to see it from your perspective, spiritually. Another category to think through is just personally. Reframing the fearful perspective to one that's full of faith. Sometimes it's just as simple as getting alone in a quiet spot or going out for a walk, maybe writing out something or rehearsing it out loud, but just summarizing what God has made clear to you and as far as your calling, as far as the vision he's placed upon your heart. Where do you know that God is leading? You may not know the next step, but if you think back for a minute, you know you've been on this journey, but you're not at a dead end, you're at a roadblock. So God, help me to understand this man's standpoint of just personally viewing this moment of difficulty through the lens of the fact that you have a God-given calling for me. Help me not to lose sight of what matters in the big picture, in the long term, spiritually. personally? How about this? Organizationally. Sometimes this is reorienting ourselves to the God-given mission, the God-given vision, the God-given strategy. I'm currently right now in Florida as I'm recording this. This week I have traveled to Louisiana. I've preached in Mississippi a couple of times this week. Visited some churches in Mississippi, and I've reached out to some friends along this journey as I've come down into Florida. As I think about one of the conversations I had just this week, we were trying a new coffee shop. This was in Gulfport, Mississippi, trying a new coffee shop. And the owner of the coffee shop is a sort of a startup. They've started as a coffee cart, then a little coffee truck. Now they have a physical building. And the owner is just very hands-on and wants to thank people personally for being there. So he came up to our table, began to talk to us. He saw my Veritas shirt that I was wearing that particular day, asked about it. He was sharing some of the core values of the organization that he's leading, the coffee shop. I, in turn, began to share some of the core values we have at the institution I lead, Veritas Baptist College. We have 4 core values, and I began to just rehearse them. For his benefit, maybe, but for mine as well. For me to rehearse these, it just recalibrates me to the fact of what God has shown us, where God is leading us. We are committed to 4 core values, and we run decisions through these values. These values include, they're all Latin words, veritas. It includes this concept of, is it true and trustworthy? Then we run through the idea of integritas, and we make this in good faith. And are the ethics behind it biblically sound? Are we operating in sincerity? Are we operating with the idea of not just trying to get a win for Veritas, but a win-win? A win for us as well as our students, or a win for us as well as a partnering church, or a win for us and maybe a graduate who's looking for some help, an integritas. We also filter everything through the lens of humilitas. We recognize we don't have all the answers. We recognize we have much to learn. We recognize that even with our best laid out plans, God has the ability to redirect that. And so we try to lead with open hands and open hearts so that God can steer us and lead us and help us to see things that maybe we missed. And sometimes he uses the strangest mouthpieces to help us see that. And then we're committed to qualitas. Can we do this? Not perfectly, because that is an area we may never hit, but can we do it with excellence? And so we filter through these thoughts, and we filter through our mission statement, and we filter through these values, and we filter through our strategic plan from an organizational standpoint. So sometimes when we're making decisions and we're not sure what to do, sometimes we'll table something. Sometimes we'll have a robust discussion. How does this fit in the mission and the strategy and our values? At Veritas, it's a little different than perhaps some of you pastors who are listening today, but we don't just simply add a program because we want to get students. It's got to be aligned with our mission. And this helps us. Like, there's some things maybe we could add to get students, but the goal isn't to get students. The goal is to train biblically those who have been called to lead, whether that's in education or practical ministry perspectives. And so we filter through that. We are comfortable in our own skin. We can't be what other institutions can be, but what God has called us to be, we just want to do it with excellency. So the idea here of organizationally is just reorienting ourselves, reminding ourselves of what is this God-given mission, vision, and strategy. Do you have a mission statement for what you're leading? Do you have vision statements? I think one of the things that helps, and I even said this past week as I was preaching in Mississippi, we sometimes substitute God's definition for success with the world's definition of success. Maybe as a pastor, you can find your success in the number of baptisms you had in 2025, or the number of new doors your people knocked on, or the number of whatever, or some metric that's important to you. And if you hit that metric, then pat yourself on the back, you're successful. But is that God's definition for success? I know for me, I can find, if I'm not careful, I can find success. And hey, here's another record. We've had some really strong enrollment. I don't know what all God is going to do with the college we're involved in at Veritas. I don't know what he's going to do. But wow, it just seems like every semester there's just a new enrollment number. It's really, we're blessed that God has given us a small token of his favor and momentum. We're grateful for it. But what if next year we're down 2%? Are we failures? And this is the trap, isn't it? We have to call ourselves back to remembering how God defines success. God's definition of success is simply faithful obedience to the calling that he's given to you. Sometimes it's good to invite fellow colleagues to speak into it and give perspective, because we get tunnel vision and they can help make sure we steer clear of that. I hope that as we think about organizationally, and we feel attacked or feel like our leadership is suspect by some, that we take a deep breath and remember that the people aren't the enemy. Satan is the enemy. A tunnel vision, just like the French people building that Maginot Line, just as that was a very expensive, foolish decision because of the short-sightedness. So too in ministry, we can often be guilty of short-sightedness when it comes to our decision-making process. Tunnel vision distorts our perception of the problem. It distorts our perception of the solution, and it distorts our perception of God. Because if all we do is fixate on the crisis moments, the difficulties, the negativity, if that's all we fixate on, we're going to start believing things about God that just simply aren't true. We can begin to doubt his timing, or maybe even doubt his goodness, or maybe start to think that his silence means that he's absent or apathetic. And none of these are true. Without the big picture, discouragement quickly turns to despair. And that despair causes us to say things about God's character that we would not say in our moments of encouragement. This doesn't just impact us personally, by the way. It shapes the morale of the entire ministry. Because a leader who can only see the moment, the tunnel vision, can only see the next, just right, the immediate surrounding, that person will begin to lead reactively, not proactively and wisely. And in those environments, we start to communicate fear instead of faith. We start to communicate urgency instead of clarity. And we start to emphasize pressure instead of peace. So stepping back to see the big picture, it's not optional. It's vital. It is vital, because the people God has called us to lead need us as leaders to see beyond the moment and interpret the present in light of what God is doing long term, and helping our people understand that God is writing long stories. Well, big picture. When you feel like you're facing an impossible situation, assess the situation, get the facts, step back and see the big picture. These help you in moving forward. I hope maybe it starts a conversation, either with your team that you're leading, or maybe with you and God. I hope that you've been challenged, if you're in the middle of something difficult, to step back, see that big picture, get the right perspective of what God is doing. And I guess the key takeaway that I've repeated a few times today that I hope you'll not forget, remind yourself that God is writing long stories. I hope that encourages you. And I can't wait to see you in our next episode as we conclude this first big movement of surveying the landscape for this decision we need to make. We'll go through one more step, and then we'll move into stage number or movement number 2. I'll see you in the next episode. Look forward to seeing you there. God bless.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Worldview with Dr. Mike Lester. You can connect with Mike at jmichaellester.com, where you'll also find more discipleship resources. Mike also serves as the president of Veritas Baptist College, an online university dedicated to training ministry leaders virtually so that they can stay where God has called them. Learn more about Veritas at vbc.edu. This podcast is hosted by Dr. Mike Lester and produced by Luke Clayton and the team at increasecreative.co. We hope this episode has helped you grow in your journey of being a faithful disciple of Jesus. And we look forward to having you join us again right here on Worldview.